So my name's Rob Hirschfeld. I'm a member of the OpenStack Foundation board. Likewise, Sean is also. Sean Roberts is on the call. And the board has been working on, board is actually chartered to define what is the core of OpenStack. And it's a pretty broad definition, but we must, through a board process, come up with what is a core project for OpenStack and what is not. And the implications of what is core or not have pretty profound implications for how the project is set. And what has been going on is the process of trying to define that started with the incubation committee and trying to help the technical committee figure out how to incubate projects, and going from incubated to integrated releases, and then from there into actually becoming core or a larger component of the OpenStack project. And so as it became clear that the board had to define these things, in the bylaws when they were formed, it just picked all of the current projects and decreed at the time that they were to be core. That isn't necessarily a workable discussion. We'll get into why some of the things that are core might not be core, or things that aren't core right now should be core, and there's a lot of interesting conversation to be had about that. But it became clear very quickly in discussions that it was not going to be an easy conversation, right? There's a lot of very passionate people about different aspects of this, about trying to make sure that OpenStack stays innovative, trying to make OpenStack be stable, making sure that OpenStack has strong interoperability, trying to help companies who have commercial interests figure out what they have to include and what they don't have to include, if they're going to repackage OpenStack, reduce the confusion around it. All of this actually came sort of to a head where the board had gotten a little bit gridlocked, imagine that, on trying to figure this out. And we had some very passionate arguments where people had valid but opposed viewpoints. And so Alan Clark and I at the time sort of stepped back and tried to see if we could figure out a way to resolve this question of what is core or not core for OpenStack. And we produced a very complex diagram that we call the spider. Sometimes you'll hear this whole conversation called the spider discussion. That's really a big mind map where we tried to map out the tensions. I'm not going to go through that. That's in my blogs. You can look at that. But what we identified very clearly is that within OpenStack there are good conflicts, good tension between innovation and stability, between commercial and open source, interest, between APIs versus implementations. All right, there's all these places where the very essence of OpenStack has a duality to it. And so trying to resolve that was ultimately where we had to come through. And we got to a point, just looking back on history, where we identified something like plugins. At the time we were calling plugins extensibility points as being essential. And we've been walking through the process to where we are today, which is a set of 10 positions about how we're going to define core. And I'm about to walk through those 10 positions. But before I do, there's a couple things I need to stage up now that I'm done with the history. The first one is that the purpose here is not to say this is core, this isn't core. We're not defining that tonight. The purpose is to define the process by which we are going to figure out what's core or not core. In the discussions, we always test the process by talking about what's core or not core. But the point here is that we're trying to define the process by which the community can decide what is core or what is not core. And sometimes people get confused thinking that we're going to answer that what is core tonight. We're not. We're just trying to define the process. From here, we're going into the Hong Kong summit. The board meeting just before that summit, we're expecting the board to take action to certify that we're going to use this process, and then start a timeline for implementing the process. And that implementation will involve the actual what is core, what is not core decision. And so that we have to have a process to make that decision that everybody understands. And that brings me to my second important point, which is that
I was just going to ask, how do you want questions? Do you want to do this bit and then do questions at the end, or do you just want us to butt in if we have a question?
I would prefer if you let me go through all this, and then
Okay.
I promise I'll stop talking in about 10 or 15 minutes tops. But what I found is if you go all the way through the process, it's much more straightforward as to what we're trying to accomplish.
Okay, no, that's fair.
Okay. But if you want to scroll them in IRC, that's awesome. I'm happy to entertain them. And in some cases, there's some questions I'm going to anticipate and try and answer as I go through the process flows. And one of the things that people need to understand is I've talked to a lot of people about this, and I'll actually represent different people's positions on this. This is not my position. I'm really working hard to try and make sure that I'm presenting a position of consensus that comes from having a lot of discussions. Sean, you've been in a ton of these discussions also, and we all try to represent a lot of different viewpoints. The other thing that I would ask when you listen to this is to consider that the goal is not simply to define core. The goal for what we're doing is also to make sure that OpenStack culture is something that that we're doing something that enforces OpenStack culture. And that sounds sort of vague, but it's not. It's very specific. OpenStack is an open source project. We want to make sure that people have reasons to upstream, to have high quality code, to engage and understand what OpenStack is about. That we want to lead the project through implementation and proof and actually deliveries. These are really core cultural components for what OpenStack is about. And so one of the things to ask as we go through this process is, does this process reinforce the cultural things that we want OpenStack to achieve, right? It doesn't do us any good to define OpenStack Core and then have people say, well, that sucks, I'm going to fork it all over the place, and then we're going to be competing with our own community. So we very deliberately look at this process and ask, are we defining the core process and core itself in a way that encourages the community to grow and thrive, or not? And so I always preamble the flowchart by talking about that exact thing, because it's important not just to look at the technical aspects, commercial aspects, but also the OpenStack community aspects. With that, I'm going to jump over. I'm going to try and share. So you're going to lose my video feed. I posted a link to this same. Here we go. This same document. And can people see this all right?
Yeah, I see a slide.
Okay. And this is backed up by, there's a lot of text on this blog post that actually goes into what these items are. And then there's a whole bunch of links that go backwards if you want to drill into spider chart and history and implementation. I think I feel like I've written a small book about OpenStack Core at this point. So let me go through the flow chart, and then we'll start taking questions. Do people understand before I do this, and this is implementation, people understand the background and details? And actually, Sean, you want to add?
Perhaps the only thing I would add, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Would be that the part of the reasoning behind defining what is core is to start to come up with the requirements around a reference architecture that we can run tests against, and be able to define what the OpenStack marks would be given, to be given to. So that would be the only thing. It's kind of a commercial aspect, or the trademark aspect to this effort. It's by no means the only reason to do it, but it is one of the things that has a definite timer on it. The longer that we let the OpenStack brand kind of hang out there without a good definition of what the OpenStack brand means, the less control we have over it. So
right.
It needs to be done sooner than later. And
I'm really glad you pointed that out. That's and there, in the back channel we have a question: is why do we need a core definition at all?
Yeah, that's my cute question. Is like I don't disagree with having core,
Right.
And what is the motivation? It seems to be mostly about trademarks. Why wouldn't we just give every integrated project use of the OpenStack trademark and bravely run away? Like, what do we gain by limiting it?
So it's a really good question. It's worth taking a minute to answer. So trademarks are actually the only enforcement mechanism. This is the primary enforcement mechanism that the OpenStack Foundation has against the use. If we just willy-nilly let anybody say anything about OpenStack, then it becomes really impossible for a user of OpenStack or an operator of OpenStack to know that they're getting OpenStack, right? The quality of the brand would diminish because it wouldn't be interoperable, right? We've heard really clearly that that's a value. So part of core is to define base components that we can make interoperate. It helps people who are using OpenStack understand what they're getting, that they're actually, is a thing that is OpenStack, and if they get it from one person, right? If somebody got the Red Hat distribution then of OpenStack, then they would have a reasonable assurance that if they switch to the SUSE one or the Ubuntu one or now the HP one or the Mirantis one and the Rackspace one, we're getting a proliferation of distributions. It's exactly the reason why we want to have core. We want to be able to say, these things must be included in core. Sean's been leading the training effort, and training has exactly the same question. If you're going to get OpenStack certified training or just OpenStack training without certification, there needs to be some consistency that says this piece is, a required component for OpenStack. It doesn't limit us, and this is part of what we'll talk about in the process flow. It doesn't mean that there won't be things in the project that are integrated, right? This is one of our key words, is integrated into the release. Those things are still going to be integrated components, but they might not be required components before you can say you are an OpenStack project. And this is going to get, there's some things that will get really interesting when it comes back to this.
So in other words, if, I don't know, Swift is core, for instance, we would require everybody with an OpenStack distribution to have some form of Swift packaged up?
Is that
Swift,
what we're saying? If Swift is core, let me put it in a very technical sense. If I am a ecosystem vendor, if I write a product that runs with OpenStack, and I say this product is certified against OpenStack Core, then I would expect that anybody who's deployed OpenStack Core could run. If Swift, so in that sense, I could go into a customer or a public cloud and target Swift and know it was there, and I'd have the confidence that if it was an OpenStack cloud, it would run Swift, assuming Swift is core. And so the idea is that it allows us to have a baseline set of consistent, it's not even APIs, it's really services and capabilities that the community, whether it's operators, users, ecosystem vendors, right, cloud providers, can say distinctly they are complying. And this really came to a head, it's come to a head in a lot of different places. In some cases, I'll stay out of that one. In the Rackspace versus HP were both running, I guess it was Essex at the time, but implemented slightly differently, and therefore not, didn't have the same, you actually had different versions of Fog had to be run against each one, but yet both complied.
I don't think we
completely.
Ran Essex.
Sorry?
We started with Diablo, and then we went from Diablo.
Sorry, you're right. Thank you. But both of them, according to the OpenStack definitions, were OpenStack clouds. So, we want to have a definition of core that is specific enough that, and now I'm getting straight into the process flows, that the user, that the community, it's not just users, the community of OpenStack understands what they can expect as the core pieces. And that even builds on integrated projects that then rely on, I'm running Trove, and Trove expects Nova APIs to be accessible, that Trove has an expectation that Nova's there.
So to summarize, it's kind of like the made for iPod mark on my headphones, right? What we're really trying to do is provide a definition that says if you write a thing that uses OpenStack, as long as you limit yourself to the things that are marked as core, anybody who uses the word OpenStack should be able to run your app. Is that a fair summary?
That is not the only thing I would say that core does, but it is one of the important ones.
Okay. Maybe you cover this later, so if you do, just tell me, how do we deal with versioning? In your example, maybe Diablo,
let me hold that one, because I do, let me get to that.
Okay, cool. Fair enough.
That's a great question. Yeah. So I'm going to move the... Good. So through all this process, we sort of boil things down into these 10 positions. And they're actually, they build on each other, and they're color coded because they do group a little bit. So starting in the top left, we start with what we've been saying. The implementations or core can use the OpenStack trademark. So we want the OpenStack brand to mean something, and so this is our leverage point. We could actually say, oh, you are you are like OpenStack, but you're not, and you're not complying with core, so you can't use the trademark. So that's our ultimate lever, and it's the ultimate. We want the brand to mean something, be something valuable. And what we're saying is core is a subset of the whole project. So there are integrated projects, there are components that are important in OpenStack, but might not be core. So core is not, we're not trying to create a single umbrella. Core is by design a smaller part. And one of the challenges we have with this is getting over the idea that a project is less if it's not core. Swift is a great example. There's a lot of people who are very passionate that Swift should not be core, and equally passionate that Swift is core.
Maybe core is the wrong word to use then.
Well, we are required to use the word core in the bylaws. We've gone down that path. That one unfortunately, we can't get out of using core. But the idea here is that we do ultimately need to say, you know what, you're integrated into OpenStack, you're an essential part, but you might not be core, and that should be okay. In some ways, core is a burden because it's going to create additional requirements for projects that are core. One of the critical things about this definition is that it can be applied equally to all usage models. So the definition of core is not going to be different for a public cloud than a private cloud versus a specialized implementation. What we're looking for here is a least common denominator core definition. And when people talk about this, one of the places we have great animated discussions is the idea of, well, okay, great. If core is this universal definition, are we going to end up having core definitions that apply to specific usage models? That's downstream stuff. Right now we're looking for a universal core subset, right? It's the base. So that sort of defines core and its applicability into the ecosystem. Technically, we implement it like this. We require the use of designated code frameworks. What that means is that in order to be core, you must use OpenStack code. The Python code from Git, from our GitHubs or in a distro, must be included in your running implementation of OpenStack to be considered core. And the idea is that the PTLs will define, here are places of the code that are required, and here are places of the code that are replaceable or swappable. In some cases, we call those plugins before or extensions. It doesn't matter in this definition. What we're doing is we're saying the technical boards in OpenStack will say this must be in, and this part of the code must be there. And there are people who feel this always generates a lot of discussion. This is considered essential to help drive community behavior and non-forking, because we want to make sure that people are using OpenStack code and not just creating an API equivalent and then effectively creating a shadow OpenStack. This requires, if you're going to use the OpenStack brand, you must use the OpenStack code, the designated aspects of the OpenStack code. I'm going to keep drilling. I know we'll come back to this point. And then we have a choice. A project must have an open reference implementation. So that means that if you're implementing neutron networks, you must have an open reference implementation that implements the functionality of OpenStack networking. That is a required piece. There could potentially be more than one. There must be at least one open reference implementation. We very much want to be completely away from the idea that functionality that OpenStack offers might be unavailable unless you have a proprietary component. That doesn't mean that it's the open reference implementation might not be the most performant. It might not be the most scalable. It might not meet a ton of actual operative needs, but the capabilities of OpenStack must have an open reference implementation. And this is it's very important that this is an and vendors may substitute alternate implementations. So if I have a Neutron plugin that implements all of the functionality of the reference implementation, I can ship that instead of the reference implementation. Okay, either one is acceptable. Both of them are paths through being core. So the reason why that's an and is I can be successfully OpenStack core with a proprietary implementation as long as it passes the next set of positions. So far, we're walking down. We now have this branch. They come back together to say we verify OpenStack using open community tests. So I'm actually really proud of how much testing and CI and continuous deployment, which is enabled by that is part of the OpenStack project. And so this position actually lays out, we're expecting that the OpenStack itself will be verified by open community tests, and that those tests can be remotely or self-administered. So the idea here is that we have a body of tests. People can run those tests against OpenStack, which is awesome and amazing, and that we expect you to be able to run them yourself in your own lab without any internet connectivity, or you could take advantage of a remote test runner like I'm all of a sudden blanking on Sean, help me out. RefStack. Thank you. That can be run by RefStack, and you can actually verify that your site runs it. So, for example, somebody who's running a public cloud could use RefStack as an independent third party to say, "Hey, look, we're in compliance." If you have a private cloud that has no external connectivity, you could self-administer these tests and make sure that you also are in compliance. And one of the things we did not want to do in having these discussions was to create the need for OpenStack police force running around handing out certification stickers for OpenStack. And that's why it's either or, remote or self. And then, so the trick is now we have this body of tests. Let's see. Sorry, Monty's trying to join. Whoops. All right, Monty, can you hear what we're saying? I imagine he can hear because
He cannot.
That's strange.
He can't.
All right, hold on. Let me throw up a join me. Which will work from a web browser.
Are we able to bring him in, invite him in, or is Oni unable to do phones?
I am going to throw together a join me that should be able to. I just don't know if the other people's audio is going to get in here. Let's see.
It's an experiment. We will find out.
All right.
He's just looking
Here's the
at your
code.
blog post.
Yeah. Check, check, check. So I'm not sure I can get audio going on this. Yep, there we go. All right, that should work. I don't know if I can get the other side of it, but at least we'll get. All right. Hey, I think Monty's on. Monty, we're just going through the pieces, and the question you were asking was about the required use of designated code frameworks. No, so you missed that piece. So specifically, and Monty, I know this is a very important point to you, and I sometimes think of this this required use of code frameworks box as your box, because very specifically, we are requiring use of OpenStack code in the definition of core. You cannot be a core OpenStack project without using OpenStack code. And that is part of the cultural test of making sure that people drive innovation back to the project. So,
yeah, because it's really the implementation of. Oh, go ahead.
So when I read something that says designated code frameworks, to me that sounds like, well, you must use Flask, or you must use Pecan, or you must use WSME. Frameworks are the bits that we build larger applications out of. But my expectation from this is that we'd be saying you must use Nova, and you may drop a vendor plugin into Nova. So if they're meant to be the same thing, I think the language in the current slide deck is not going to suggest that to people that see the slide deck. Maybe we could use some different language there.
I'm open to other language. We had some discussion about this in previous meetups, and what I'll ask is let's hold that for as part of the discussion. I'm entirely open to it, and if we can come up with better wording, I would love to see it. So let me just wrap this up, and then we'll come back to that, because that is one of the most. Yeah.
Just quickly, American Rob, just to differentiate the two Robs. So what you're saying here, to pick on the Nova example, you're saying, the designated code might be, the Nova core code, and then the vendor substitutable bit is, say, the hypervisor driver layer. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes. And
okay, cool.
Specifically, this is, so when we first proposed this, we used the word plugin and extension, and that got an allergic reaction, frankly, from the PTLs and the TC, because it seemed to be stipulating an implementation. And so what we did was we pulled back and said, look, TC, you tell us what things we must require from a code position and where it is safe for people to substitute. And that is up to the TC to decide. What we know is we do want to be able to allow vendors to substitute pieces. So Neutron plugins are a great example. Cinder plugins are a great example. Alternate hypervisors, great examples. There's a lot of places we enable people to make changes in OpenStack, and based on the spider, we really want to encourage that. That's great behavior. As long as you can implement them, as long as there's a reference implementation that doesn't require you to use a proprietary implementation.
Right, so it seems like Michael's cute patch about patch sets, if you've got patches to the core, is going to tie into that same discussion. So I'm going to hold my purple colored paintbrush for later, and we'll come back to it.
Great, thank you. And there's interesting mitigations that we have as we get a little bit further along. So I just walked through the point where we had open community tasks that could be self-administered, and this is where we get into the real meat of what makes something core or not. So everything else is sort of here's what we're packaging, and then we're saying, you know what, of these tests, some of them will be chosen as must-pass tests. It is actually the board's responsibility, based on the way the governance is set up, to identify what is core. Identifying what is core would be identifying what is a must-pass test or not. There's an expectation in our discussions that we'd have a nominating process that would be facilitated by the user committee, and there's a whole bunch of implementation to put around this. But fundamentally, the idea is we've got this big body of tests that anybody can add to, anybody can work with, and we're going to identify a set of those tests as must-pass. And then the must-pass tests, if you can pass all those tests in your implementation, you are now core. So if I build an OpenStack deployment and take it completely out of the box and set it up, I should be able to pass all the must-pass tests with my reference implementation, and I would know that I have an OpenStack Core cloud. If I then substitute a vendor's component into that and once again pass all the must-pass tests, then I can also say I am OpenStack Core. Or if I have a public cloud service that passes all the must-pass tests, once again, that cloud could claim to be an OpenStack cloud. And now we're back into, we've gone full circle on the loop. Sean, did I miss something? Yep, I lost him.
No, you didn't lose me. Sorry.
Okay. No worries.
It's multitasking. No, I don't believe you did. Nope.
Okay. I'm going to switch off of this and go back to visual, so that I don't know if it's helpful to see me talk or not, but let's see. There we go. And then I'll trust people to refer to it back on their own from the web page. Cool. All right. So anything to add for that? That's sort of the description I usually give, and then we can start drilling into questions.
Well, just so you know, there's a queued question on IRC, but maybe you'll get to it later. Rob and I, New Zealand Rob and I, are trying to understand vendor proprietary patches on top of required code. So what if, for example, I have vendor patches on top of Nova API? Does that mean I'm no longer core compliant? Or is that okay as long as it doesn't alter functionality that is tested by the core test suite?
Boy, so if you're actually replacing some of the Nova core code?
Yeah, well, and I think this is a really big slippery slope problem, because if you say, yes, it's okay to do a patch, at a certain stage, a patch becomes an entire rewrite. So...
Right.
Well, and this happens in Linux kernel land, right? So vendors, I don't know, not to pick on Red Hat, but as an example, Red Hat has patches they apply to the kernel that might add, say, drivers for network cards that upstream kernel doesn't have.
Right.
So what if, for instance, I wrote a vendor patch on top of Nova API that implemented compatibility with Google Compute Engine? I'm not removing functionality, but I am adding functionality that gives me a proprietary value add, but I have kind of no incentive to push it back upstream.
So this is where that clause, that first blue box comes in. If you are not running the designated code frameworks, then you are not core. And so the situation you're describing, if somebody patched it and didn't upstream that patch, I would say they're not core anymore. Now, we're not going to create a police force to enforce it, but that would be, right, this is about driving community behavior. If somebody has something, if they're changing the required components and not upstreaming that change, that's bad. We want to not allow somebody to claim to be OpenStack if they've done that.
Okay. So bearing in mind, I'm just exploring the idea here. I don't have a particular problem with that stance. Do I need to make my environment work, but they haven't had time to land yet? So cells in Rackspace land, for instance, right? We ran that for a while, and we were running the code review gauntlet, which Chris did a really good job of. but it took us probably 6 months to get that stuff landed.
Right.
For that 6 months, we'd have to remove the OpenStack trademark from all of our public websites.
What if you? I'd say so. For that scenario, cells have been contentious because they were a big change and they came in big chunks and they were hard to get right, and they're still not right. So, I mean, it's a really good one to use as a test case for policy around this. I would say, at an absolute minimum, the code has to be visible in the community. Let's say it hasn't passed review, but it's up in Garrett. That is at least at the point where people can be collaborating on it and benefiting from it and saying, yes, we're part of one community. I don't know if that's sufficient, but I think it's definitely necessary.
So there's a...
Because I think if you pick on the cells example, it's probably not visible in core compliance tests, right? Cells could have been written so that you didn't detect it was running. So how do you tell if someone snuck a patch in is my other question.
And we're not trying to create a police force. So there's a couple of components here. One is, I don't think we should assume that everything in OpenStack will be a core piece. And potentially, with the way we're defining tests, not even all the components within an individual project. So one of the things about this definition that I really like is that we stop arguing about whether Nova is core or not, but actually which tests in Nova are core or not. And it could be that the suite of tests that cover cells isn't core, and that you would actually argue that you would pass, the cells aren't core yet because they're not passing in a sufficient number of sites. And one of the things I didn't talk about here was that the idea is that the must-pass tests are not defined by I've been describing the board as a star chamber, by the board in a vacuum during the foundation, every 6 months. What we want to do is we want to define this based on implementation. So actually getting field data about what tests are passing in the field, at which sites, right? Actually look at it. And if we could say, oh, you know what, only 30% of OpenStack deployments, based on some measure, we're going to have to figure that out, used the cells, then those tests wouldn't become must-pass tests, and then you would say Nova with cells is not core. These other components are. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense, but I think you kind of segued onto a different question.
Probably.
And that question was like, how does something become core? But the question that I heard Michael ask was, if I have a substantial change to something that is core, for example, Nova scheduler,
correct,
which cells impact, it's a significant thing, or Nova API. If I have a significant change to Nova API, and the must-pass tests for that pass still,
correct,
but I haven't pushed that change up. It's not even in Garrett yet. Nobody knows that I'm even running it. Or maybe they know, who cares? Am I still able to get the trademark tick?
So there's a couple of...
And that seems to be like a big hole. Like you say, we're not trying to create a police force, but it seems like there's a gap where, on the one hand, you can say, this is what you're expected to do, and on the other hand, this is what we're testing, but they only overlap a bit.
So there's a couple of things in what you were saying. One is, we're not going to try and protect against sort of the person who wants to make changes to the code and keep it secret, and then claim their OpenStack. They can do that, but probably not at scale. Although I completely admit one of the things we're doing is enabling, and this is one of the places we actually have a lot of discussion usually. We're actually enabling that behavior, and one of the reasons why we have the requirement that you must run core is for that. But I would expect, you've made a couple of different cases, and I think they're really interesting cases, but several of them would involve known extension points. And so a lot of what we'd expect in the cultural test on the core flow here is that we'd actually expect somebody who wanted to do that type of change to upstream the change as a plugin extensibility point and say, look, I'm not going to share this way I'm doing things with you, but I am going to identify an extensibility point I'd like to see added. and help and expect that you will help, that they'll actually upstream the extensibility point with a reference implementation so that they're in the clear on doing that. Some of what you're describing also is around release boundaries. So we've discussed this a little bit. When do you actually certify? And so the expectation is that the tests that for a version, say Icehouse, right, would be certified within a certain time period, ideally within 2 weeks. It could be longer. As the board would actually say these are the tests that are must-pass tests for the Icehouse version, and any point after that, if you certify, you're good against Icehouse, and then that certification would you could play with it. You could be in it. You could make changes. The market would actually punish you if you misrepresented that you had certified against Icehouse and then changed it after the fact. If you're doing a kernel patch or something like that, it's most likely going to be, maybe I'm naive on this, but it's going to be against code that you're trying to get in for the next version. We're trying to create a stable, predictable, we'll know at the feature freeze point, we should know what the must-pass test candidates are. I don't expect there to be a lot of surprises with this. There shouldn't be. And then once you get to the release, it would be pretty clear what the things are or not. And if you're patching the kernel at release time, we've got a more serious issue, frankly.
So I want to reinforce that I'm not necessarily trying to describe ill intent. Let's say I'm trying to land a really big feature and I want it to be in the required code and I'm happy to give it to upstream.
Right.
But it takes me more than one release to get it to a state where upstream is willing to take it, but I have customers using it.
Sure.
Does that mean for that transition period I have to stop calling myself core, even though I'm trying to play by the rules?
It's a great question.
And how do we stop people diverging like that and then just, never getting back to the one single code base?
So let me ask it for you. Would you consider what you're describing to be an OpenStack fork, or just code that is open but hasn't been merged upstream yet?
The latter. So cells, to keep going with that example, was thousands of lines of code. It took more than one release to land in upstream, but that wasn't for lack of trying. It was, it was written for a specific use case, and then that code had to become more general before it was, a consensus could be reached.
So somebody would want to release their version of OpenStack with that code in it, but that code couldn't have been certified?
Right. Rackspace could be running that code in their public cloud, right? Maybe we need it in order to achieve the scale we're currently at, for example. And, we want to give it back, but, the process of giving it back might take a long time because we have to reach a consensus.
Right.
But in our period of time, we still need to run it so that we can continue to scale our own individual business.
The only time that would be a problem is if it was changes to one of the designated code frameworks.
Which sells, so I think we appreciate that. I just like to underline here that as an example, Cells is great because it is 95% changes to code that Nova will designate as being in the required frameworks.
Okay. And that's
just as context for the discussion. It is almost entirely changes to that code.
And so Rackspace uses that code, or would want to use that code in its commercial offering, and that would, by this definition, force it to be non-core, is what we're saying.
Well, that's what Michael's exploring, yeah. And
yes.
I think it's a great
question.
And again, I want to reinforce that Rackspace doesn't necessarily, I don't speak for Rackspace, I'm here as just a dude, but Rackspace has done this in the past, right? And what you're effectively saying is we would have to change the entire way we developed things. We would have to do them in small chunks, incrementally in upstream, and that would be significantly slower, and sometimes maybe slowness isn't possible when you're running a large public cloud. I don't know, I'm just exploring the idea.
Slower, Michael. But isn't it? So let's put the velocity thing aside, because I think that's a TC discussion that we need to get on top of. It shouldn't be slower to collaborate with 1,000 developers who want the thing to be great.
Yeah.
But the thing I think is really interesting is whether or not you have to be complete. Like, in this scenario, all of the other Nova tests are passing. All of the ones that are currently considered trademark tests are passing.
Right.
But there's a bunch of changes to the code, which means that if you look at the code running in the Rackspace public cloud versus the code currently in trunk in this scenario, they're not the same. But all of that code, because Rackspace know they want it to be public, is up in Gerrit. It's just not useful for anyone yet, because when you look at it in Gerrit, it's got 1,000 -1s on it.
Okay.
So, to me, that seems like a situation where they should be able to retain the trademark. The tests pass, they're playing in the community, they're not forking off and going down in their own little silo. That seems like the behavior we want to encourage. And they should get the reward for it.
I strongly agree on that one.
Maybe we could be more explicit. Maybe we could be more explicit. Maybe in that scenario, what's expected is that Rackspace goes to the TC and asks for a hallway pass.
Right.
We are running these patches. They are in the review process. They don't cause any required tests to fail. We publicly disclose we're doing this thing on the understanding that we're trying very hard to land it.
What you have just described to me is a very good test for what we're talking about, and actually one of the reasons why I like this approach, because Rackspace can come back and say concretely, I am passing all of the core tests. I am interoperable from that perspective. And I think that if you came back and said, the code that we're using is in OpenStack, it's in the upstreams, and it's in these designated areas, I would say that would be an argument where you could do it. We might want to explicitly enable somebody to do that, although I'd rather handle it as an exception process. This is one of those things where when we discussed this, we didn't want to create a legalistic definition. What we wanted to make sure of is that people who are using, are contributing the shared parts of OpenStack back to OpenStack. And as long as they're demonstrating that, I think that the intent of what we're doing is there. It would be different if they had patches, proprietary patches to core. Frankly, we've seen this to an extent where there's changes to Swift that people sort of put in that aren't accepted as part of the body of Swift to create Swift compliance. And Swift ends up being an interesting test for these things, where you can comply with the APIs but not implement Swift. And so in that case, this wouldn't pass if Swift is core. Now, if Swift isn't core, it's a different, we end up with different questions.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, continuous deployment makes this worse too, right? Because I'm already in a world in which I'm taking code out of Git, I'm trying to run it, I discover I found a bug, I fix that bug in my continuous deploy, and then I try and push that bug fix upstream while still running forwards with deploying this thing. So I imagine any team that's continuously deploying OpenStack will be constantly jumping away from upstream, but then trying to merge back.
This isn't
everybody if I have my way.
I'm totally in favor of that. Here's the trick: it's supposed to be a point-in-time statement. We're not trying to say that every moment of every day you must, especially if you're a continuous deployment shop, you must be in compliance. What we're trying to do is establish, for this release, here are the tests that you must pass to be in this. You guys are describing great cases where I think that if you look at if you're ahead of trunk on this, I don't think we're going to have issues with OpenStack, especially if you pass the tests. I think that without the tests, the questions you're asking open up cans of worms that would be a mess. With the tests, I think it becomes much more straightforward. You can say, I passed the tests for Havana at this point in my cloud, and this was the state of my code. And then at that point, you are now OpenStack Core. And if you advance beyond that point, and you're still passing the test, we should be good. That's not a problem. The point is that we want to be able to give you a milestone point where you can certify, I am in compliant with OpenStack, and I've remained in compliance because I'm passing the tests. That's really the ultimate thing we want to make happen. And then if you want to be ahead, or if you have patches that you fixed a bug that haven't been upstream, haven't been merged in yet, those things are fine. We're not trying to get down to that type of detail.
Yeah, I think that now that we've talked about it, the bit that seems important to me is intent. You can be in front of upstream for required code as long as you intend to get those patches back by, say, the next core test milestone.
Right.
So if the goal is to get it back before Icehouse lands, for example, then have at it. But people should be expected to regularly get those patches back in.
I'd prefer a much simpler test rather than something of intent where you're sort of predicting the future. I'd just like to say, if the code you're running is in Gerrit and it's visible to either the security team or to the core team for the component, and you're responding to review, you didn't just do a code dump there and walked away. Those two things, in Gerrit and you're responding to code review, that's enough for me to be confident the organization is moving forward in the right direction.
Yeah, I'd be fine with that as a test for intent. Are you talking in the community about the state of your code?
Right.
Well, I'm being a bit more precise than that. I'm saying in Gerrit and responding.
Yes, but that's how we talk about our code, right? So yes, I'm agreeing.
So I think we could easily extend this to say.
But we don't want to conflate.
Go ahead, Sean.
Do you guys hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. So there is an important distinction between the spirit of law and the rule of law, and I'm using the word law very loosely here, but also the interoperability piece compared to the implementation of the code base. So those things we're going to have to separate in some ways, because if, for instance, an implementation goes far off the reservation and is no longer interoperable, and it is a service provider with other implementations of OpenStack, that should be a problem. Now, if that lasts for a long period of time, let's say months and months, and they're no longer interoperable with other implementations of OpenStack, and therefore customers that used to be able to use it now can't, because they're compatible with OpenStack and this other implementation was but isn't anymore, that should be a significant problem.
It should be, but I don't know if you got the subtlety, but with what Michael and I have both been saying, that is not possible in the scenario we're talking about, because we're making the statement that all of the must-pass tests nominated by the Foundation are still passing.
Right.
Yes, yeah, okay, with that caveat, I understand.
Right, and I think it would be worthwhile to make the statement that we're expecting, you must run the OpenStack code, but that it's acceptable to have code in advance of the release, basically ahead, as long as it's been contributed to the community. It's not going to be acceptable.
Right, which is what I was trying to capture.
Right.
Yeah, as long as we have some sort of control point where we're like, you can't be using patches to add addictive features and then never, contributing them back. We don't want people locking customers into their implementation by having, the secret sauce awesome patches on top.
Right. So I was going to vector away a little bit. We were talking about 6B on this. So this actually, I think, comes back into the same. This is a good segue. So we're talking with item 6B about substituting implementations. Is that if the vendor does not pass all the relevant tests, the vendor is required to include an open source reference implementation. Oh, sorry. This one's maybe needs to be improving in the wording. The idea here is that if I was, to give a scenario, let's say that I had an OpenStack appliance, and that OpenStack appliance had a storage backend that was not that didn't pass the compliance tests. It had slightly different performance characteristics, and there were tests that failed. The idea would be that somebody purchasing that appliance could use the open source reference implementation if they needed to, and they wouldn't be beholden to have a implementation of OpenStack that didn't pass all the tests. So the idea of 6B was that somebody could sell an OpenStack cloud, get it to pass all the tests, and then with the user's permission, substitute out pieces that then didn't pass the tests. And so the idea here is that we want people to be, if they buy something, we want them to be able to be OpenStack compliant. but we recognize there might be some cases where a vendor has a component that doesn't pass all the tests and they still want to ship it. A really good example of that to me would be if you had a storage backend that didn't pass all the tests but was still adequate for your needs, or it was an experimental driver or something like that. It lets you make alterations, but the users still have a way to get all of OpenStack. Does that help clarify things? It's a little bit confusing.
Yeah, would you see service being excluded from that requirement? Or if I wanted to swap the world out for something proprietary as a service provider, do I just run a single region that is vanilla OpenStack, even though I don't think anyone will use it? Like, the appliance example makes a lot of sense to me, and I like that. And it makes sense to distros. I'm just not sure how you apply it to service providers.
I think that it would. I think what you're saying for a service provider would be exactly right. If it would allow somebody to say, I just want OpenStack Core, and this is the one that I have. And if they had enhancements, they could provide an alternate. I think you're right. For a service provider, you'd have to simultaneously provide multiple implementations. Because at that point, if you didn't pass tests, you wouldn't be core. And you couldn't claim you were OpenStack. So somewhere you're going to have to provide that. Now, one of the things I do believe is that I think core is going to be pretty small at the end of the day for in this pass, and that functionality that that we're going to have interesting arguments where people believe things are absolutely required. I think the Venn diagram is going to be a relatively small subset of the total. And Michael's back. And this is one of the things that's important with this, is that we want to be able to have the community and ultimately the market enforce some of this. One of the things that we would expect people to do is publish their reference architectures, or for OpenStack to publish reference architectures, because the reason self-certification is important. If I have say I'm EMC and I want to have a Symmetrics backend for OpenStack, I don't expect everybody to be able to set up a Symmetrics as their backend, and so EMC must be able to self-certify with that capability and say that they're working. If somebody, a customer of theirs comes and runs OpenStack with Symmetrics backend and can't pass the tests, then I think in the market that information is going to leak out very quickly, and so it's not in any vendor's interest to claim OpenStack certification with that isn't real. And it's not in anybody's best interest to not disclose what configurations they had that created a certifiable OpenStack, because at that point you're going to end up with a he said, she said, right? Oh, well, if you'd put the Symmetrics on the left side of your room, it would have passed, but you did the right hand. Sorry, we can't tell you how to do the left-hand side, right? I think that the market is going to have a lot of influence once we've defined these patterns to sort of pressure people to be in compliance. Maybe I'm naive, but it's something to...
Well, there's also been some discussion about the implementation of RefStack that this has not been completely agreed upon, but there's been a lot of discussion about how to make public the details of which entities passed which tests and which configurations.
Right.
Much like how Top 500 or any of the other public type of reference implementations would be scrutinized. Customers and users would want to know, which configurations do you pass in which way. It would be pretty important. And I think it would be even just as important for the ones that don't pass. So like a service provider that has multiple configurations, one that passes core and one configuration that passes and another that doesn't. Maybe it just doesn't pass in certain areas. I would think they probably would want to make that public in some way, and that may not be such a bad thing for them to say, well, in this non-performant way that we do it, in our speak, we pass core in this performant way, we don't pass core, but look at these cool numbers. So.
That's a really good point. One of the things that we'd like to do is have people not hung up on 100%. Obviously, you have to pass core, but we're at over 700 tests, right? So I would expect that one of the things that we're trying to do is have people write a lot more tests. The more tests we have, the better. We're going to end up with tests that it should be impossible, ideally. Actually, I'll make this as a strong statement, Monty. If you're still on, want to chime in on this. I would love to see the case where there's so many tests in OpenStack that it is impossible to pass all the tests because we've tested configurations that simply can't coexist. That's a great place to be, and actually what that means is that we start having qualified test results where you have to be able to say, I passed the tests for, and we were talking about flavors at the last summit, for a flavor that involves quantum networking in this configuration, but not Nova networking. I did quantum. I'm so close to 100%, and I blow it when I'm at the end of the day. Does that make sense from that perspective?
Does to me.
Okay. Yeah, and we've gone on an hour and basically an hour. My plan was to go another 20 minutes and then wrap it up. I can seed questions in where I know we've had discussion points, but I'd rather entertain new questions.
Well, maybe we can talk about the purple-colored byte shed now.
Okay, let's do it.
So you said people were allergic to the idea of saying you can use vendor plugins and vendor extensions. Can you tell us what made them allergic so that we don't retread those steps?
They were allergic to the word plugin.
Okay.
And the word, so what happened is when we originally came up with this, the big insight from Spider, from the Spider discussions, was that plugins were necessary. This sounds really silly at this point, but what we realized was that we had to have OpenStack had to have a way to allow people to swap code in or out in certain places, and so that ultimately became the foundation of a lot of what these discussions have turned into, and then that led us down into how do we verify that if I've substituted an implementation that it's workable, and that's what led us to the must-pass test concept.
Right, none of that I think is contentious.
Awesome, that's great. It's an amazing statement, actually. Good.
Well, it's not contentious to me.
Good.
Was the concern that if you said you're allowed to use plugins that it would be abused, or that it didn't represent the sorts of things we'd expect people to change? Was it not broad enough?
The issue with plugins there were a couple of them. The first one was not all projects implement plugins, and so the TCs didn't want to be force dictated that every project must implement plugins. And some projects like Oslo, it's just going to be 100%. I don't see any way to do plugins on it. So the allergic reaction was, hey, board, get out of our technical pie. Tell us what you're trying to accomplish, and we'll figure out the right way to do that.
Right. Okay. So what we're looking for is some words. So the thing I want to get away from is saying designated code frameworks. Designate is fine.
Right.
Code frameworks, and it's totally a technical thing, but code frameworks mean something very different than what you describe.
So could we just eliminate the word frameworks?
Sure. That would make a huge difference to me.
Do other people feel like we can convey the meaning by saying designated code?
Yeah, works for me.
Yeah, it works for me as well.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. You're not the first person who has felt that frameworks was saying something more than necessary. And after
you could also call it required goo if you wanted.
The OpenStack goo is coming to your town soon.
It's,
I don't know.
You know what we could? How about if we did it as designated upstream code? Would adding the word
Yes.
upstream be useful?
Yes. I think that captures the sense of it very well.
Okay. And that also covers the item that we spent some time discussing, because now it's clear that if you've upstreamed the code, you're in the clear based on intent.
Yep.
I like it. I think that is clear. Thank you.
Not exactly how we say it, but one of the more I talk to groups outside of OpenStack about OpenStack, and I have to boil it down into really simple, straightforward, but technobabble terms. The idea of that OpenStack is not trying to set standards, but by implementation is really the implementation of OpenStack is the strength of OpenStack, which keeps it vibrant and in lieu of setting standards to try to code against. That is something that whatever we say, and maybe just saying exactly what you said, does that we need to get across. That it's what we're trying to do is ensure the stability and longevity of the code base by implementation of the code. Since that is how OpenStack lives and breathes. Did I say that right, or?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a very important point in all of this. And so, and that's part of the thing I like about what we're doing with tests is that we're actually driving implementation even further.
One thing we haven't talked about is that this isn't the end-all be-all mark that will be created. That there very likely will be some form of OpenStack API compatible mark, although that's not what we're trying to do. So.
That is definitely a can of worms where the very fact that we're creating must-pass tests is really inviting people who are API compatible to OpenStack to be able to verify, say, hey, I can pass all these tests. And we're specifically not granting that mark at this point.
Can we also, when I look at that diagram, it says, here's some stuff that we can't measure, and then here's some stuff that we can.
Right.
And if you pass the stuff we can measure, you get the mark. Could we also make it a condition of getting the mark that you assert or that you warrant that you meet the conditions around the stuff we can't measure?
Yes. That if you're claiming the mark, you are making statements for both the tests and the code inclusion.
Yeah. So if someone comes along and they re-implement the API, they can't in good faith warrant that they are running the designated upstream code.
Correct. And if we found out that somebody had lied in that case and claimed the mark and they weren't doing that, they would be subject to lawsuit by the OpenStack Foundation.
As well as losing the mark.
Correct.
Unless their new API was in Jarrett and being actively code reviewed.
Correct. Well, right. If unless if they were using an extension point, a known extension point, then that would be acceptable, right? And this is part of the conversation.
No,
Go ahead.
This goes back to the cells example, right? So maybe my new example is I'm rewriting the API to scale better or something.
Mm-hmm.
But it takes time to land. So yes, I warrant that I am running upstream code, except for this bit that I've confessed to on Jarrett and that people are reviewing it that we're trying to land in the upstream code.
But Michael, that makes it upstream code. It's circular. There's no problem there.
Right.
So disclosing it to upstream makes it upstream? Is that
Not putting it in Garrett. No, those are two different things. When you put it in Garrett, it means you've signed the CLA. It means it's under the Apache license, and it means it can be used by everybody. That is very different from I've put it in GitHub and it's under proprietary license that lets you show the code but not use it.
Right.
Well, I meant our Git repos, but yeah. Okay, so Yeah, I like the
Very
side effect.
specifically.
When you put up for review, you have licensed other people to be allowed to use it as well if they want.
All of that stuff is covered by putting it in Gerrit, which is why I'm using putting it in Gerrit as the test and not it's just randomly disclosed.
Okay, no, that's cool. I hadn't thought of that.
Right.
Yeah. So if someone comes along and re-implements the API by switching it out for something in Java, that they can't just put in Gerrit because it doesn't. It's not even the same code base.
That's right.
But there is actually a use case here, which is where I thought you were going with, Michael, for a second, but you veered off, which is that we've kind of got this thing where Keystone that we're running now is not the original Keystone. This is a rewrite of Keystone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we probably want to allow some space for people to do these big rewrites and do it and run it when it's far enough along and get the trademark. But,
Yeah, the Nova EC2 compatibility is a good example, right? It's stateful, it's horrible, it probably needs a rewrite, but you need to allow people to do that in flight without losing the right to the trademark. But I think we've covered that.
Well,
yeah, I think we'd say if it's far enough along that it's in Gerrit and it's got code review and it's become upstream code, even if it's still not something that everyone else wants to pivot to yet, that should be enough of a test.
and well, the EC2 APIs are actually a really good test point on this. I mean, they're an extension, so they're not going to be in the required subset. One of the things that I like about this is that if we get data that the EC2 APIs are passing tests in a considerable percentage of deployments, then we'd have an expectation they could become must-pass tests and thereby become part of OpenStack Core. But in order to do that, you would have to write tests. You would have to have those tests passing at a substantial number of sites. You'd have to go through a vetting process. And so one of the things we haven't talked about much is that these tests are not going to just pop into existence and then become must-pass tests. There's actually an expectation that there's going to be some data that we're going to collect, and we should watch tests, especially on these incubated and then integrated projects, start to pass in more and more sites and then become must-pass tests based on a history of implementation where those components are actually being used and establishing value. And we might see this opposite happen where a capability like Nova Network is tests high and then starts losing interest as we've replaced things. And that would speak to me of the Keystone changes that we saw, where if you switched Keystone APIs, you might actually see the old API going down in popularity and being replaced by a new one, at which point you'd make changes to what is core.
I think so I guess to me I'm not disagreeing with you, I'm just trying to cast it into different words that make more sense to me, which is to say that we've got two separate dimensions we care about. One is, can users depend that if it's got the mark, it will do the job? And the tests define the common set of this is what you can expect out of any OpenStack cloud, the must-pass tests. So in an API replacement, if you break those, you break that contract with our users, and that would be bad. And it doesn't matter whether your stuff's upstream or not, that's bad. And we're not loosening that constraint, we'll still be testing for it. The other dimension we care about is whether the energy that people are putting into their OpenStack product or deployment, depending on whether they're a distributor or a public cloud, is channeled into upstream, into the commons. We want to make the commons better, not to set up 5, 10, 20 different companies directly competing with each other with the same development going on behind closed doors. And the is it upstream test is important for that. Now, the interesting thing about an API rewrite is that what you're actually saying is we want to segue a bunch of that development effort off to the side for a period of time to build up something that's much better and then pivot it into place, which is a TC operation where they say we're going to take that code base and deprecate it, and that code base is going to become the new shiny.
Correct.
So I think, again, I would say that the new code base has to be in Gerrit, it has to be in the OpenStack project, not in Stack Forwards, for something that's core. I mean, that should be self-evident. And it's going to need the program, not the project, the program which is aiming to do a replacement, to be collaborating with it. I think saying it has to be designated upstream code is enough, because if Nova's PTL is behind this, they will be able to bless that new code base as soon as it appears and say, yes, it's going to be a year before you're ready, but I support what you're doing, and that can count as designated upstream code. It is within their remit to make that statement.
And the reason for that, having that block, is to drive exactly that behavior, right? What we want to do is we don't want people to fork. We want these contributions, especially in the common areas, to be driven back into the project and enrich the project. And part of I've had this as a discussion actually with Monty, is that ideally somebody who needs a capability in the shared code, in that upstream code, would be incented to push it back in. So let's say in the Cinder plugin, you want to be able to have live volume migration, and in order to have live volume migration, you must expose additional APIs. Well, the person writing that plugin would have to then push that to shared code, would have to invest in helping make the reference implementation support it, and then ultimately that would enrich the project as a whole, even though you might need a proprietary implementation to fully bake it in. And if they wanted it to be core, it's entirely fair that they might have that capability and not have it be core, but then the APIs wouldn't express it. And this is what's really cool about this, requiring it to be shared code. If I have a feature that needs an API, then the vendor is going to be working in the community to extend the API so that they can then be part of the community, rather than just creating, slapping their own special code in to expose an API and then not sharing it.
So something that occurs to me, perhaps it would be useful to have a FAQ for operators and for distributors and value adders of all sorts about what they should need to do under some sort of common circumstances, because the questions Michael is asking are ones that I think lots of people will ask.
Totally.
I want to rewrite X because I think it's bad and I'm willing to put the effort into do it. How do I do it?
Mm-hmm.
Answer, you get sign off from the program PTL, you get your code base into OpenStack/blah, and at that point you can switch to it whenever you want. Don't let the tests fail.
I like it.
I want to be able to do security fixes and performance fixes in my production trunk on my public cloud, and some of those are embargoed. What do I do? You do security patches in Gerrit, you do normal patches in Gerrit, and you do those before you deploy, not afterwards.
FAQ makes perfect sense for this. I think you're right. We're definitely going to get into these nuances where we have to resolve it. So.
And Rob, you don't have to write that by yourself, right? If you started an FAQ on the wiki, as long as you keep half an eye on edits, maybe people can answer their own questions.
Right. No, and that's my expectation. This is I've been trying to capture these things, but we're transitioning off to this being blessed, formal process written up in all its glory, and being part of the OpenStack wiki. So the goal, and actually we should wrap up because people need to go, and we've gone our 90 minutes. The goal here is that we're having these conversations because we want to get community feedback. We want to make sure that the implementation of this is something that people understand, that it makes sense, that we're not imposing something in the community that doesn't make sense to how the community wants to operate. And so I've been trying to weave a careful balance between providing enough information that people have something concrete to talk about, which I feel like we've had a very concrete conversation with specifics, but at the same time wasn't such an official document that people felt like we had made all these decisions and we couldn't adapt and adjust. That the time for that transition is coming where the board actually needs to take some motions and put these things in place. And at that point, we're going to have to write these down and create the FAQs and the documentation, the wiki, and all those things. So that will come. I didn't want people to feel like we already wrote, engraved these things in stone and they couldn't object if something seemed wrong. Just like we changed the language today.
So one last question: who defines what these tests are that we keep talking about? Is that a board level decision, or is that the TC?
I love it. So that the board ultimately is according to the bylaws, the board ultimately has to certify the tests. In some earlier discussions, it seemed to me like the user committee is really, because the tests represent use cases that we see in production, that the user committee should be responsible for nominating which tests are must-pass tests and helping organize that effort. And then on the TC is responsible for actually production of the tests and identifying the tests and enforcing the tests are created. So one of the things I liked about this is, as we thought about it and discussed it, was that there was actually a discrete role for every component of the community, right? The TC's creating tests, user committees collecting data about what's implemented, the board for doing a certification and being sort of the last stop on this process. But
so the only bit that worries me there is finding engineering resources to actually implement the test.
yes,
I guess it's in most people's commercial interest to do it because it means we're all on a level playing field. But I just worry about it not being an exciting new feature and people only wanting to code new features.
I believe that this is going to create a lot of commercial interest in tests. And part of I'm a huge test fan. One of my goals with this is that we create a commercial reason for people to be putting engineers into test and writing tests. So an example would be if I was in the ecosystem and I had written a product that required OpenStack to work in a certain way, and there's a lot of them now, then it is in my interest to write tests and contribute them that validate OpenStack the way I use it. And it could be that those don't become core, but there's a huge incentive now, and there's a huge culture that we're trying to encourage, where people actually write tests to ensure that OpenStack works the way they want, and then share it. So
It kind of sets up an arm race, if I can be so bold.
mm-hmm.
If you're an operator and you think that having, shall we say, a particular responsiveness from your API is an important thing, and you want that to be something that everyone should have, so that people who want to use your cloud don't say, I can't depend on that, because if I depend on that, I lose my vendor portability.
Right.
You can say, hey, look, we want to enable this class of users to really get out there and use our stuff. We need to help that become a core part of the mark, which means we need to get tests there, and we need to help the reference implementation pass it always, and we need to get enough users, enough deployers deploying it with this thing working, that the user group will certify this is a reasonable thing to require all OpenStack clouds to the board, and the board to sign off on it.
Right. And
there's a clear path then to say, if you want to guarantee this to all your potential users, this is how you do it.
Yes.
And that goes.
And that strikes me as a very positive cycle, right? I think there are ways that you could potentially have it gamed, but by using actual test passing in the field, rather than people arguing in a boardroom whether or not this is a test or not, I think that the implementation-based results are much, help prevent the gamification of it. Otherwise,
I also like the use of feedback from users about what users are deploying, what they're finding important. I love that feedback being part of the system. Good.
To me, that lines up with OpenStack being implementation focused rather than API driven, right? Or specification driven.
So I'm a little
yes.
I'm a little confused of the idea of overloading the user committee with this responsibility. Where did that come from? Is that just an idea you had, or is somebody else brought that?
No, it's an idea that we've had in some discussions. I don't think it's finalized yet. We need to figure that out. And the overload of the user committee is a concern. for this, and so we need to figure out if we're going to do that, and then the foundation has to decide to fund it. And the whole thing, the same thing is true with using RefStack or not. A lot of these implementation ideas are just that. They're implementation ideas that the board is going to have some discussions about, and we're going to have to lay things out.
Okay.
So and I'm glad you're glad you're stating that it's not at all part of it's not written on the flow chart. It's not a current position. It's an idea for implementation.
Yeah. And technically speaking, a ref stack is still just a concept as well. It's not solidified. But
Totally right.
my thinking is that we would create a committee that would not that we need another committee, but one that has specific focus of implementing something like RevStack, and the other half of the responsibility would be working with the TC to define what are the core tests. And I would think that would be a different makeup than the current people that are involved with the user committee.
I suspect
Not
you're
to
right.
mention the user committee has a very specific charter, and I wouldn't want to get them distracted from doing that, because I think what they're responsible for doing is super important.
I totally agree, and
So, anyway.
I think this is a discussion for the board as what the next phase is, right? We are going to need a committee. We're going to have to figure out how to implement it. We're going to have to figure out how to pick the tests. We, in the process, we haven't even said that we're using the Tempest tests, right? It could be that it's Tempest plus others. It could be, those are still implementation decisions that we have to get to as the next phase. And
Yeah, the big hairy ball mess. It's something we're gonna have to tackle.
yeah, this is this is a step closer. It's not all smooth sailing after this. But good, gentlemen. I really appreciate your feedback and the discussion. I think this is. We always have surprising and insightful conversations, and I learn more things about OpenStack with every discussion, and I really appreciate it.
No, thanks for running these in my time zone. I had a lot of questions, and I feel like I got a lot out of this. So
Great.
even though there was only a few of us, thanks for doing it.
My pleasure.
Likewise, I second that.
Thanks. I'm happy to have the conversation with you guys, and then I'll be in your time zone in a couple of weeks. So if something else occurs to you, actually, I like to always close on the same note. Everybody, as much as we're trying to be accessible, not everybody in the community participates, and it's really important for people to understand that this, what we're talking about is being vetted and being discussed, and we're accessible to the conversation and ideas about it. So please help us represent, what's going on and the process, and that you've listened to it, and your opinions have been heard. And that if it makes sense, great. If it doesn't make sense, keep bringing it up. We want to keep talking about it. But this is part of the process, and thank you for participating in it.